Hello and welcome to Paul on Politics, our regular review of all the week's news live on KMTV. And don't worry, we've stocked up on throat lozenges and paracetamol to get us through the next 30 minutes. Now, of course, most people do suffer coughs and colds at inconvenient times, but for Theresa May, being struck by a nasty virus couldn't have happened at a worse moment. Despite battling through her conference speech, the inevitable headlines were not about policy, but about whether she could hang on to the keys of number 10. So, are we too tough on our politicians, and should the Prime Minister's fate be determined by a single speech? Also in the headlines are student fees. Promises by both Conservative and Labour parties to reduce student debt have put the issue in the spotlight. But what do the various pledges really mean? With us on the sofa are Professor Richard Scase of the University of Kent and Rob Byrne, an MA student at the Centre for Journalism at UKC. Thanks to both of you for joining us. First, a look back at how Theresa May had what by any measure was a bad week at the office.
The Conservative Party conference was meant to be an opportunity to start over, to rebrand the party that won an election but lost a majority in June's contest.
I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
Nevertheless, the event was overshadowed by tension between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and the speculation about the strength of her leadership. She soldiered through a prankster handing her a P45 allegedly from Boris Johnson.
Boris, job done there. Given her the P45.
A persistent cough and even a stage backdrop malfunction. By the end, it seemed the worst was over and the party could move on. Enter former party chairman Grant Shapps, who took to the airwaves to confess he was the force behind a secret plan to ask Theresa May to leave the job. Speaking on the Today programme, Mr Shapps said the time has come. You can't just carry on when things aren't working. The solution is not to bury heads in the sand. But what do Kent MPs think? We spoke to Damien Collins, the representative for Folkestone and Hythe.
It would be incredibly self-indulgent of the Conservative Party at what is a really important time for the country to become too distracted by gossip around the leadership. I think there are really important issues people want us to be getting on with, important domestic issues, like housing, like investment in services, particularly the NHS, but also to deal with the very serious Brexit negotiations as well. And I think to pause all of that while we spent 3 months debating the leadership of the party and electing a new leader would not be the priority for the country that people would share.
Well, Richard, it's definitely a bad day at the office of Theresa May at the party conference. But, we all make mistakes and we all have coughs and colds and injuries. Are we a bit tough on politicians?
I think we're very tough on politicians, but I think, slightly provocative point maybe, but I think the coughing, the sore throat, reflects in a sense her vulnerability and the problems she's facing in terms of her stature in the country. If you're really self-confident and you feel as though you're in control and you're going to make a major statement to your party, you don't have to make lots of speeches, do lots of interviews and meet the press again and again during a conference. You choose your interviewers carefully, you choose your timings carefully so that you're going to make sure you don't have a sore throat, that you don't have coughs and colds. So the coughs and colds are a result of her vulnerability rather than the vulnerability creating the coughs and colds.
Sounds like she was getting bad advice, perhaps.
I think she was giving very bad advice because clearly it reflects all the interviews she's been doing, her need to want to get more popular, to communicate, and the trouble is the harder she's tried, the heavier she's fallen.
Rob, what did you make of it? I was watching it as if it was a scary episode of Doctor Who from behind the sofa going like that. How did you see it?
Well, I think David Aronovich put it perfectly on Twitter yesterday. He was saying about how the job that she's wanted for the last 20 years, she's been Home Secretary, she's held a number of shadow cabinet positions, she is actually now paralysed by the very thought of doing the job itself. And I agree with you that you would not allow those things to get the better of you necessarily. The letters falling down is one thing, and that's just, you
couldn't make that kind of thing up.
Not make it up. But I truly do feel sorry for her as a person. I think we need to humanise politicians a little bit more rather than just seeing them as, I heard the term hubristic being thrown around a lot when she called the election that she didn't have to call. Stupid decision in hindsight, but she's a human being and let's treat her like one.
Yeah. Well, what I'd add to that, Paul, I think is that, I agree entirely, Rob, but when politicians or celebrities lose it, it comes over somehow. Their self-confidence gets destroyed.
I was reminded of Ian Duncan Smith, who had similar problems.
Years ago,
made
that's
a speech
right.
at the party conference, and within 3 weeks he'd gone.
If you lose belief in yourself, somehow other people can tell very, very quickly. And if you're a politician, of course, and particularly if you're a prime minister, that's not good news.
And I think the other issue for me was that having all these cabinet ministers and loyal MPs declare their support actually undermined her authority, because if there wasn't a question about it, why would they have to do that?
Then again, I saw Isabel Harbin tweet about this morning as well, and she was talking about how she doesn't really live in she lives in a sweary world as a political journalist, but the amount of Tory MPs and Tory aides who just had the most disparaging things to say about Grant Shapps for launching this, I think it resonates that even though maybe a strong Prime Minister wouldn't need this kind of support and intervention from her nearest and dearest colleagues, but still, it shows that people aren't quite ready to let her go yet.
But once you have these kinds of debates, I think, that is again kind of confirmation that you've lost it. The problem is, I think, the reason why there hasn't been a more stronger coup up until now, although we'll see in a few weeks' time, is that who's to take her place? Because I think her replacement will possibly rip the party apart.
Do you think that's likely? I mean, let's hear what Damien Green had to say about this today when he was asked about the future for Theresa May.
Well, but my message is that if you've got disagreements, have them in private, not in public, and that it's frankly self-indulgent to think about leadership elections at a time when we are halfway through the most important negotiations about the future of this country that we've had for the past 40 or 50 years. Now is absolutely not the time to be inward-looking. Let's be outward-looking and act in the interests of all our constituents.
Are you 100% certain that she's going to stay as Prime Minister?
Yeah, absolutely. She has a great sense of duty, she has a huge strength of purpose, and she will be putting that into practice as Prime Minister for many years.
Well, Richard, Damien Green there saying he's absolutely 100% certain she'll stay on as Prime Minister, but we all know in the turbulent world of politics, it's been turbulent for about 2 years now, that nothing like that can be assured, can it?
No, and particularly if you say that, of course, you're reinforcing the doubts, the questions, the debate. The best way is just not to reply to anything.
But you have to, because there's people like me, the whole media spotlight on the Tory party. He can't just stay silent, because staying silent would be interpreted as lack of support.
Maybe, I suppose, but there's no reason why you do need to give the interview. If you don't give the interviews, then presumably that helps the thing to go away. It's once you start giving the interviews, as I say, I think the problem is that who would replace her? Because I tweeted a few weeks ago, would September, well, I've got my timing wrong, would September be the month when the Tory party split? And I'm still inclined to stick to that prediction. It may not be September, and it wasn't, but it could be sometime this autumn. There will be a big divide, and of course, over this incredibly, what lots of people now regard to be a very boring, dull and tedious, but nevertheless vitally important issue, Brexit.
Rob, you were talking about politicians being humans. It kind of does suggest that we are perhaps a little too harsh on them and don't recognise that they have the same kind of frailties as all of us.
Oh, of course, but ultimately they have to be able to do the job as well. They are human, but they have expectations and responsibilities with which they actually put themselves forward to do. I think
that's a good point.
They
choose to stand for public office.
They must be subject to the due criticism, and I agree with you. I mean, who on earth is going to replace her? I mean, David Davis was the bookies' favourite. I'm not sure if he still is. But the issue is that he's already had a tilt at the top job, and he had a very successful campaign for the first half of it. And then at the Conservative Party conference in 2005, he had this terrible speech. It's kind of like, it's a bit of a pattern, isn't it?
Yeah, OK. Let's hear what some people in Maidstone think about all this.
I think she's doing a good job, but I think she should do more on Brexit. I think she's sort of holding back a little bit. That's what it appears to me.
The main characters, I understand, to be lining up possibly from what I saw watching this week last night. I don't like any of those at all.
Well, as a committed Labour supporter, I would prefer her to stay because she's been a total disaster. We've seen it in Kent, we've seen it right across the country.
I think she was stoic to actually stand up and to try and do a speech when she wasn't very well. I think the party should be like standing behind her really and helping her.
I think we need a strong leader. I don't like the division in the Conservatives at the moment.
The House of Commons is, what I've seen of it are quite elderly people or middle-aged. It'd be nice to see my generation kind of step forward and come into power.
She definitely should stay. This is the time to have unity and not to be divided, and she's not been in there long enough. They ought to give her more chance.
Well, Richard Scase, how long do you give Theresa May? I mean, are we going to see a sudden coup or a long drawn-out replacement battle?
I mean, I think it could struggle on until possibly the spring. I think she's in a difficult position because I think, as a number of commentators said today in various parts of the media, what does the Conservative Party stand for? We really don't know what it stands for.
Well, infighting seems to be
well, the infighting indeed, and the inability to put up signs on the backs of walls at party conferences. But I no longer know what the party stands for in terms of Europe, in terms of home affairs, in terms of social policy.
Because we know they're abiding by the will of the people and negotiating Brexit.
Well, I think the will of the people has completely changed, as of course is reflected how the will of the people constantly change between elections. And I suspect the will of the people argument no longer stands. And in actual fact, as far as the British Constitution is concerned, the will of the people is represented through Parliament, not through referendum.
We'll be returning to this subject at some point, I'm sure. Now, coming up after the break, we will be looking at the thorny issue of student fees, so don't go away. Welcome back to Paul on Politics with our guests, Professor Richard Scase and Rob Byrne. Now, there's something of a war of attrition over student fees, with both Labour and the Conservatives pledging to ease the pressure on hard-pressed students. Louisa Britton spoke to Professor Tim Luckhurst at the Centre for Journalism about the different pledges and how the Conservatives are using the issue to attract younger voters. She began by asking him if this is a policy meant to grab voters from the Labour Party.
It's certainly an attempt to take Labour on their own territory. Students are traditionally assumed to be Labour voters, so this is the Conservative Party trying to reach out to them by making the loan system slightly easier on current undergraduate and postgraduate students.
Labour said these plans are desperate, as it were, and do you think that the Conservative Party is coming under a lot of pressure at the moment?
It's desperately keen to attract some of the youth vote. Traditionally, of course, younger people have tended to vote Labour, but at the last general election, there was a colossal swing to the Labour Party amongst younger voters. There was a greatly increased turnout, and the Conservatives are worried that literally their electorate is dying off. They're the older voters. So yes, they're desperately trying to get some Labour voters.
Labour's also said that they're going to scrap tuition fees. Is this feasible in the long term as well?
I think that Jeremy Corbyn has made a promise which he might come to regret. Scrapping tuition fees for current students might just be possible. What he's already recognised is scrapping the debt incurred by those who've already graduated would cost an absolute fortune. And the Labour leader's got to make some decisions about priorities. If he's going to make promises of that kind, then some of his other spending promises become rather less plausible.
We're hearing a lot about Boris Johnson and his sort of comments. Do you think that the Conservative Party appears united at the moment?
Well, it's certainly made a good effort at sounding united this afternoon. Mr Johnson said that he supported the Prime Minister entirely, that he was very much in support of her approach to Brexit, that she was a steadfast leader. He'd also called for the British lion to roar and said we should stop being so glum about Brexit. It's all going to be very exciting and very positive, and there's a great future ahead. Well, perhaps. It was definitely a show of loyalty, but I noticed that many of the delegates on the conference floor and the conference circuit in Manchester were getting quite irritated with Mr Johnson. They feel that he makes a show of loyalty from the platform, but that he's being critical of the Prime Minister in his newspaper column and has been very difficult for several weeks. He certainly hasn't been the loyal star that the Conservative Party has been looking for.
Well, Rob Byrne, you must feel like you're in a buyer's market here. You know, all the parties are out for your vote. What do you make of the Conservative pledges?
too little, too late. You know, when she announced it, I just thought, you know, thanks, Tess. What's that going to do for me, really? I mean, my generation, you know, obviously the 2012s where they raised to £9,000, and obviously where I am now, where I paid that, it's not going to affect us at all. Obviously, I never bought the Corbyn. Well, it wasn't a promise at all, was it, to wipe tuition fees?
It was a vague commitment.
It was a vague promise to look into the possibility of doing it, but you know.
But I mean, in a sense, you're saying they're both as bad as each other, really, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I mean, so many of my contemporaries are so pro Labour, but they fail to see that Labour started this. They started these rises from £1,000 initially, and then to £3,000, and it was going to be exploited by a later government in the end, and you know, I won't let them off the hook for that.
Richard, you know, it does seem a fairly modest proposal from the Conservatives. It's not really sort of matching Labour pound for pound, is it?
No, it's not. But Rob is right. I mean, Labour, in a sense, let the cat out of the bag, or whatever the phrase would be, years ago. But I think a broader issue here, too, is that because students are now a very significant constituency. We're talking about 500,000 students at any point of time. And, of course, their votes now count for a lot compared with years ago when only 5% of the age group went to university. When you have 50%, then this is a constituency that both parties, not both parties, all parties, are working hard for.
Yeah, they skipped over a generation. I was interested looking at the Conservative Party conference when they, you know, pan around the audience, just how old a lot of the activists are. I mean, the Conservatives do really need to do something, don't they, to attract voters that have not supported them before.
They're really not helping themselves, though, because they're cutting ties to a lot of their youth wings. You know, Conservative Future has basically been defunct since about 2015, and there was a ban put on socials last year by a lot of Conservative Future sects at universities. So I don't think they're doing much even to woo their own side of the argument, especially people who aren't especially political.
I mean, I don't know whether the Conservatives consulted with any students about their proposals, but it does sound rather like we better think of something quickly,
That's right.
Otherwise we're going to lose big time.
I mean, Rob, I mean, the young Tories used to be dreadful, didn't they? Absolutely dreadful.
I have many friends there.
And they present the hooliganism as kind of young people having fun.
Well, they're not here to defend themselves.
That's
so
right. But Paul, I noticed that also at the party conference. I mean, no one under the age of 60 seemed to be there. But, I mean, much has been said about how Corbyn was offering this bribe to the students. Remember, the Conservative Party offer a continuous bribe to pensioners. You know, the triple lock, free bus passes, inflation-linked pensions, the heating allowance, which is not means tested. Okay. So, I mean, this bribing goes on by both parties, not just Corbyn and the Labour Party.
It's called politics, I think.
It's called politics, absolutely.
But let's hear from Damien Green about his thoughts on the Conservative promise on student fees.
There will be more to come. We've said that as well as the measures we've announced that I know will be very welcome by graduates, so that they don't have to start paying back their loans until they're earning $25,000, and freezing the current fees as well, which helps current students. But we're looking much more broadly at the whole tuition fee system, indeed the whole university system, to see why, for example, every course in every university costs the maximum amount. That wasn't what was intended. That can't be right. Whether some courses could be 2 years rather than 3 years. If students work more weeks in a term, then they wouldn't be piling up so much debt. There's a lot to be done in this field, so we are looking at it very radically.
Well, Rob, Damien Green there saying there's more to come. And one of the things he mentioned was actually maybe reducing the time of courses, which seems, you know, a sensible proposition. What do you make of that idea?
It's
2-year degrees instead of 3-year degrees.
Too little, too late. I mean, it might. I'm not going to slag off the proposal completely. I think it could help in some cases where people don't want to pay as much for it. I know that Buckingham University is a private uni, and many friends of mine went there to do their degrees instead because it meant about a £5,000 saving. But I think the key thing here is that the whole tuition fees debacle here, it really has just turned into a Ponzi scheme, hasn't it?
Well, Richard, we know a lot of students are actually studying abroad, you know, in Europe to.
I mean, it's cheaper, yes, to do degrees in the Netherlands or in Germany than it is in the UK. The thing that crosses my mind, Rob, is that I have a view about non-laboratory subjects. I wonder whether you need 3 years full time, but we have 500,000 students at university, and yet we have an acute shortage of teachers, an acute shortage of doctors, of engineers. So what are these students doing 3 years full time? Something doesn't seem to match somehow.
Yeah, well, they could be, they could raise the pay cap, couldn't they, in the public sector? I think that's also the problem with hiring teachers. Another issue.
Well, it's the end of the conference season, obviously, and MPs are back in the Commons next week. So let's get your views on how you think the parties have fared. Rob, we haven't spoken at all about Lib Dems or UKIP, but UKIP a spent force, do you think?
I think that they could have taken on quite a more radical anti-Islamic agenda if Anne-Marie Waters had won. I've not seen anything from Henry Bolton that's particularly invigorated any UKIP supporters that I know, or anything at all within the greater public. Vince Cable is obviously being the continuity candidate in the sense that Tim Farron wants to push for this second referendum on Brexit, and he wants to engage with the public again on that debate. But as
they are a bit of an invisible presence, aren't they?
They are, yeah. I'm not seeing any momentum, excuse the pun, behind them.
Richard, what's your view? I mean, UKIP have got this new leader, Henry Bolton, who seems very organised and well respected. But, no specific policy programme at this point.
And he's aiming, apparently, to be adopted as candidate in Folkestone.
I think he's got an eye on a Kent seat.
He's got an eye on a Kent seat, and Folkestone was the last one that I heard.
But do you think they're a spent force? Do you think they're no longer needed?
I think they're a spent force because there's no clarity of policy there, there's no clarity of profile. What do they stand for? And for most decent UK people of all ages and ethnicities and so on, they have kind of hardline policies which I think people find unacceptable, which they find slightly nasty, and there's really no need, in a sense, to join UKIP when you have certain sections of the Conservative Party pursuing their agenda. So why would you?
How do you see Labour at the moment? They had this love-in in Brighton, masquerading as a conference, and they're very buoyant. But if there's not an election until 2020, they've got 4 years to sustain that kind of mood. Do you think that's possible?
I think people are. I think they're slightly over-exaggerating this Jeremy Corbyn's potential here. I mean, even after all of this, I'm going to say it again, momentum, even after all of this, the most recent YouGov poll suggests that Theresa May is still 3 points ahead in terms of the question of who would make the best Prime Minister.
Was that pre-conference?
This was on the 4th to the 5th of October, so yesterday, really.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the Sundays show this weekend, doesn't it? Because, yes, I mean, what's interesting, they all present... the opinion polls present Corbyn as a nice guy, a genuine guy, etc. and so forth. But when the question gets asked, who would you like to have as Prime Minister, then they still prefer Theresa May to Jeremy Corbyn.
Let's ask both of you, when do you think the next election is going to be? Briefly.
Not before 2020.
I think there'll be another election within the next 12 months.
And after that, another referendum, perhaps?
And I think it'll be all coupled up with another referendum. I don't think we'll leave Europe. I don't think there'll be a Brexit. Maybe in name, but not in substance.
It's a bold prediction from Richard there, a nice one to end on. So that's all from us here at Paul on Politics. Thanks to our guests for coming into the studio. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, you can catch up on all the latest political news in Kent by logging on to kentonline.co.uk or following me on Twitter at Paul on Politics. Thanks for watching.